Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now yesterday we took a look at the new AMD Radeon RX 9060 XT, both the 8 and 16GB models in comparison, and found that in some cases the 8GB of VRAM did indeed hold the cheaper card back. All in all though, I came to the conclusion that for the money, about £240 here in the UK for the Sapphire Pulse version, it is amongst the best graphics cards that you can get. Of course, the used market is also an option, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Now I think the closest to the 9060 XT 8GB in terms of used market options is probably a 3070. Now unfortunately I don't have one of those, but I do have a 3060 Ti, a very popular card from back in 2020. And one of my all-time favourites, to be honest. Today we're going to be seeing how the 9060 XT 8GB compares to the 3060 Ti, which is of course an 8GB card as well. This is not the GDDR6X version, this is the standard GDDR6 model, and you can find these for about £200 on sites like eBay. So while the footage may look slightly different today on this side-by-side comparison, both benchmarks were conducted under the same conditions. If a game didn't have a built-in benchmark, then I just basically did the same thing in the same level of said game. We'll start with Doom the Dark Ages here. Now I've tested at 1080p for today's one, and here we're starting off with the medium preset with the texture pool is set to 2048 as well as TAA enabled. Now the 9060 XT 8GB hit 83 FPS on average with a 1% low of 66 and a 0.1% low of 65. The 0.1% low of the 9060 XT was actually the 3060 Ti's average 65 FPS, and here the 1% low was 49 with a 0.1% low of 45. So it was consistent with both cards, I think is fair to say, but of course the 9060 XT 8GB pulled ahead by quite some margin. Keep an eye on the VRAM usage throughout this one as well, because you're going to notice that it is quite high on both GPUs, even at this resolution. For Red Dead Redemption 2, we have the Ultra settings with TAA set to high. The 9060 XT 8GB hit 84 FPS. Now you may remember in yesterday's video this was about 10 FPS lower than the 16GB card. The 1% low was 69 and the 0.1% low was 55. The 3060 Ti hit 72 FPS, so 10, 12 FPS lower, around there. The percentile figures were 60 and 53 respectively, so that gap does close a little bit as we make our way down the figures, but all in all, once again, the 9060 XT pulled ahead as expected, considering it is the newer card. In Cyberpunk 2077 then, we have the Ultra preset. Now the 9060 XT 8GB hit 104 FPS, a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 69. I think this was one of the games that didn't perform too differently from the 16GB version when we ran through the tests yesterday, which was quite a surprising result. In comparison to the 3060 Ti, well, this hit 83 FPS, so quite a big difference. Sorry, I was just doing some maths in my head there, about 20 FPS lower overall. The 1 and 0.1% lows were also quite a bit lower with the 8GB 3060 Ti as well. We're testing The Witcher 3 next with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset, or RT Ultra preset here. The 9060 XT 8GB struggles a bit here, 37 FPS overall with a 1% low of 19 and a 0.1% low of 9. The game just turns into a stuttery mess after a while. Interestingly, the Nvidia card didn't suffer the same shortfalls here despite having the same amount of VRAM. It actually held pretty steady throughout our testing today. It looks as though this one handles VRAM utilization more efficiently. It doesn't seem to use as much with the identical preset as evident on screen here, and this means that it runs smoother with Nvidia's older card. 41 FPS with 1% lows of 33 and 25, and compared to 19 and 9 this feels way more playable. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was also a decent result, but as I mentioned yesterday, the 9060 XT 8GB seems to suffer from an intermittent stutter problem. Not significantly, there's just a little jump in the frame time graph every so often, and as a result of this, while our average was 83 and the 0.1% low number was 66, our 0.1% low came in at 33. Now when we compare this result to the 3060 Ti, yes, the average is lower, about 9 or 10 FPS, and so is the 1% low, but our 0.1% figure was better. In terms of the percentile numbers, the game was more consistent on the 3060 Ti, which didn't have any dips or drops really, at least not in and around this town here. It was super smooth. The occasional dip and drop isn't too noticeable on the 9060 XT, but I think it's worth pointing out nonetheless, as the 16GB card yesterday didn't suffer from this problem. Interesting to note that the 8GB 3060 Ti doesn't either. Helldivers 2 next with the Ultra preset here. This was quite a close result actually. The 8GB 9060 XT hit 91 FPS overall with a 1% low of 86 and a 0.1% low of 82. Well, I say close, but it was close in terms of the average, put it that way. 85 for the 3060 Ti with a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 74. So a little bit better with the 9060 XT as expected, I think, and a bit more consistent too. Now you may have noticed that I have retested a few of the games since yesterday, and that is because I was using FSR 4 sometimes yesterday because we were comparing two AMD versions of the same card, so we had access to FSR 4 there, an override in the Radeon software. Here I changed FSR out for TAA, and this is something I've done for a few other titles as well, just to make sure that both cards could utilise the same anti-aliasing solution. GTA 5 here then, 88 FPS on the 9060 XT 8GB with a 1% low of 71 and a 0.1% low of 66. The 3060 Ti came close in terms of the average, 84 frames per second overall, with a 1% low of 65 and a 0.1% low of 57. Now when it comes to CS2, well, we actually have a victory for the older Nvidia card here. The RTX 3060 Ti hit 248 FPS compared to the 9060 XT's 209. That said, the percentile lows swung back in the AMD card's favour, 136 and 115 compared to 124 and 108. Not really a noticeable difference if you didn't have a frame time overlay enabled. This isn't a difference that you would actually feel, not in terms of the percentile lows anyway, but I think it's an interesting result, and I'm surprised to see the 3060 Ti doing quite a bit better on average here. Maybe this is a common thing, maybe Nvidia cards just run this one smoother. I don't know. In this case, it seems to be true. We'll finalise then with Black Myth Wukong, probably the most demanding of today's tested games. Now, yesterday we saw that both of the RX 9060 XTs, the 8 and 16GB versions, hit similar results. Here we saw 43 FPS with the 8GB card, a 1% low of 36 and a 0.1% low of 34. The 3060 Ti still hit plus 30 FPS, just about 33, but it dropped below that in terms of those percentile numbers with 28 and 25. Overall, I don't think it's too bad of an effort from the 3060 Ti, which is a good few years old now. At the time, it was really hard to get, and if you could get one, the prices were probably rather high. I managed to find one, I think, from eBay. I thought I got a good price, and then the next day they were restocked on the Nvidia site, so I felt pretty stupid because I paid like the same price for a used card. To be honest, it's one of my favourite cards and it remains that way. The 9060 XT 8GB, as I mentioned yesterday, is okay, especially if you live in the UK and you've got less than 250 quid to spend on a brand new card. It's one of the best options out there, but I think it should be called something else, or the price should be lower still. Less than 200 for a brand new 8GB card I think is reasonable in 2025. But there we are. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.